Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this panel, which is we're going to talk about neurotech and neuroscience, the next way, the latest trend on the investment side, but most importantly on innovation more in general. We are definitely at a turning point in neuroscience and neurotech. There's been latest development where treatment have been replaced, are being replaced or complemented of drugs are being replaced or complemented with neurostim that becomes more and more important for patient treatment, not only addressing local, specific local treatments, but also coming more and more into important disease and having a more systemic approach to the patient. And that is going through the brain, the very important organ that we survive on, and neurostim has a specific role in that. So I'm gonna share this panel with a set of very exciting stories and innovators and leaders in the space that I'm gonna shortly introduce. Just as a start, myself, I'm a managing partner at Panakes, active fund in medtech and also in neurotech. And I'm going to introduce Matt, maybe to start on my list here, that is the CEO of Paradromics. Paradromics develops brain-computer interface. We're going to use this acronym as BCI a lot in this panel, so become familiar with it, and to restore communication and independence for people with severe neurological disease. You're going to tell us more about it later on, Matt. Alongside Gil, who's also working on BCI with a group, as general manager and working with a group of 40 people on a number of indications, specifically BCI and support to mobility, alongside other that you will elaborate on, Gil. We have Ken, a CEO of Sinaptica here, and is a pioneer. Sinaptica is a pioneer on neuromodulation for treatment of Alzheimer. Very challenging, and you're going to tell us more also, Ken, about it. And Hikai, CEO of Aneuvo here, and this is a wearable approach, developing a platform to address chronic condition and improve patients' quality of life. So thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your thought and discussing this list of questions that I'm going to start with. And to start, I will ask you simply the very simple, in one sentence or in 1 minute, what is the biggest unmet need that your company addresses? I mentioned a number of conditions, but the one quick medical need that you're going to solve with your innovation and your companies. So I'm going to start at the end. Hikai, if you want to start.
Sure. Thanks, Diana, for the introduction. So at Aneuvo, we are focused on spinal cord injury. So we're trying to help the patients with spinal cord injury, and many of them with complete injury, to regain their function and restore their voluntary movement. So as we know that for patients with spinal injuries, although they are clinically complete, but there are residual neurons connecting below and above the injury. So we are developing the non-invasive spinal cord neuromodulation technology to reactivate those neural pathways so that the patients can regain their voluntary control. That's what we are focusing on and we are working on right now.
Thank you very much. And Matt, go next.
Perfect. So our company makes a brain-computer interface. It is basically a modem for the brain to move data between a brain and a computer to a brain. So it's a very powerful platform technology. And we could talk about individual conditions that we're going to address, but I think I would frame it a little more broadly, which is that there are a lot of unmet medical needs in neuroscience, in neurology, where the cure for those conditions could be decades away. It might not occur in our lifetime. Biology is a really slow problem to work on, but what's interesting about the brain is that in addition to being a biological system, it's also a data system. And so the insight, in my opinion, about sort of modern BCI is that the brain can be addressed at the data level, so that something that is not curable, like blindness, can be reframed in the standpoint of data, where you have a high-resolution camera that actually sends data to the visual system. Paralysis, you cannot regrow a spinal cord right now. You cannot reverse the effects of something like ALS, but the activity in someone who's paralyzed, the activity in their motor cortex is intact. So a brain-computer interface can grab that data and allow them to regain autonomy in their life. Even things like mental health right now, our paradigms for mental health kind of suck right now because you have to go see a psychiatrist and they ask you questions and they fill out a checklist. They give you a bunch of drugs and you come back and do the same checklist. That's a very data impoverished way of working with the brain. But a brain-computer interface can read out brain states in real time at high resolution and change the way that we see how medications work, how traditional neuromodulation works. So BCI as a platform is really about taking biological problems and reframing them as solvable technology solutions.
Fascinating platform approach, but nevertheless, you mentioned ALS and mental health in your speech, so we'll come back to that maybe. Gil.
Yeah, hi everyone. So, I'm a neuroscientist in training, and the way we think about therapies in the brain is really there's the top of the brain, the cortical structures, and then there's a lot under them. And the way I think about it is that really to solve the problem and the challenges of pathologies related to the brain, one needs to build therapies that allow for interaction between those subcortical, those deep part of the brain, and those superficial parts, those cortical structures. So at IOTA, we're building technologies of exactly that sort. And in the context of therapy, we're developing therapies that really empower stroke survivors to gain back their mobility after they've exhausted all options. Currently in the U.S. alone, there's hundreds of thousands of stroke survivors that would apply under the criteria of what I just mentioned. Excited to talk with you all today.
Thank you, Gil and Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Diana, and thanks everyone for being here. The unmet need that we're solving is a holy grail of medicine. It's Alzheimer's. Currently, there are 2 approved drugs for Alzheimer's. After 20 years of chasing the amyloid hypothesis, we finally have 2 drugs that do clear amyloid, and the disease continues relentlessly. So these drugs barely work and they have dangerous side effects. There have been deaths in the active arms of both. So there's an enormous unmet need, but think about it from the human perspective. We're talking about Alzheimer's, right? It's a death sentence. You will die. And it's one of the most gruesome, horrendous deaths that you can imagine because you're slowly losing your sense of what it means to be a human and you're dragging the entire family into it. Now let's flip the perspective. What if it was your parent, right? What would you do? Would you drop out of your workplace to take care of your mother? Would you take the time to get 24-hour nursing care? Could you afford a nursing home at over $100,000 a year that's not reimbursed? This is some of the human toll on the survivors of Alzheimer's from the patient perspectives, caregivers. And that's the unmet need that we're also addressing with our brain stimulation therapy. It's a personalized approach to brain stimulation. We're using a safe, effective technology, TMS. We're pairing it with EEG in real time, and we're delivering it in a highly personalized way to the networks that drive human memory in the brain. By stimulating those brain networks that drive human memory, we strengthen them. And that's how our therapy works. We have 2 phase 2s done and completed with completely successful results in Alzheimer's. And when was the last time you heard that? Completely successful results in Alzheimer's at 6 months and at 12 months on all the gold standard endpoints that the FDA requires for drug approvals today.
Wow. Okay. Okay, guys. So let's start with giving a little bit of setting up a little bit the scene on the investment side, on the investment world, right? The ecosystem. There are some in neurotech in general. There's some segments which are attracting a lot of capital, a lot of money. We should probably mention the big raise in BCI, a company that I'll let you maybe mention, Matt, but there were a number of big raises in the space too that you can also refer to. But what's your take on the investment landscape? Why are the investors so hot on anything that's BCI related?
So the thing that I would say, maybe in a more kind of conservative crowd like this, a kind of medical device crowd, I think a lot of people are looking at BCI and seeing the market enthusiasm as an act of extrapolation. And I'll explain that from the standpoint of people who are working in BCI and are enthusiastic about it and are expert in it. The reason why there's so much investment in BCI right now is actually because valuations are coming from an act of interpolation. And here's what I mean. we know what BCI can do today. We have one data point that says that people who are paralyzed can get brain implants that allow them to control a computer again, speak again if they've lost the ability to speak, control robotic arms. We see early evidence that you can stimulate images in the brain with stimulating BCIs. We have another data point, which is that just from a first principles perspective, the brain is the material substrate for all thought. Everything that we experience comes in through our sensory cortices, and everything we do leaves our brain through our motor cortex. And we understand how neurons in these areas, roughly speaking, behave. And we know that if we capture enough of these neurons in the motor and sensory areas, that we can provide a completely immersive experience for a person that would substitute for their sensory inputs and motor outputs. We know that every mental health condition in the end is taking place in the brain. And with a sufficient number of neurons that you can talk to, you can address a lot of mental health conditions. So what we see is that there are already markets where you can solve an unmet need and access like multi-billion-dollar markets with low clinical risk. And the future of BCI is one where devices are getting better. They're doubling, just like the semiconductor industry, just like download speeds for home internet. And they're moving toward this future that everyone gets really excited about and people write sci-fi movies about. And so there's this classic like asymmetric risk profile for investors where they say, worst case scenario, I buy in and I have a single-digit billion-dollar med device kind of blockbuster exit. But that's like worst case scenario, but like the future is uncapped. This could be the next internet. It could be the next, these companies could be the next NVIDIA and Apple tech companies. And so I think that's why you're seeing people like Sam Altman leaning in, people like Elon leaning in, is because they recognize this really interesting spread of opportunities.
So that's how you raised 100+ million, right?
Yeah, and $100 million is like paltry for the opportunities at NBCI. And you see like the raises are going to keep getting bigger.
Well, congratulations, because in this market conditions is not obvious in general, but definitely it must be the size of the addressable market that makes it a big and beyond what's imaginable today, right? Probably.
Yeah, it's the combination of having this really, really big TAM that everyone gets excited about, and also having first steps and beachhead markets that are actually really defined from a clinical perspective, where you have unmet needs, you have high expectation for reimbursement. So it isn't just, people aren't just like spraying money out there and praying. And I think there's a really good pathway.
Thank you. And Ken, we've seen a number of good raise also on the Alzheimer's side, but it seems like it's, despite the opportunity being very interesting, it's slowing down a bit at the moment. It's not like big raise like on the BCI front. Why do you think it is? I mean, Alzheimer's is certainly a huge medical need, right?
So I have a little bit of a different perspective on the BCI space, and it's hard to ever bet against Elon. So I won't say there's no opportunity there, but we've been in the brain for a long time. We've been sensing in the brain for a long time. There have been companies that have attacked restoring sight, like Second Sight, which unfortunately went bankrupt, but they were able to some degree restore some sight. So the BCI space has been around for a while. The cyborg promise of the BCI space is really interesting, and it's far over the future. Can you easily show a pathway to billions in sales? It's hard. It's over the horizon. It's difficult to see in a lot of areas of medicine unless you're really addressing underlying root pathology of some of the biggest diseases in the world. And, it's a terrible curse, the locked-in syndrome. It's a small market, though. We're talking about, on the other side of that, diseases like Alzheimer's that have 7 million affected lives in just the United States. As I said before, each one of those 7 million people has been handed a death sentence. So the difference in the time horizon is a lot shorter for Alzheimer's. But I'll address your question, Diana, by saying, there's this thing called FOMO, and that's real. And there's this thing I call FOLUS, which is maybe different. It's fear of looking stupid. Alzheimer's is such a tough space.
No, that's true.
Such a tough space. There's been 99% failure rate in Alzheimer's, right? So investors are extremely, as you'd expect, very sanguine about that failure rate. And so approach everything with a lot of caution and probably some bias. probably some bias.
Yeah.
But here's what I would say. 20 years ago, I had my first phase 3 experience at Baxter chasing the amyloid hypothesis. $20 billion and 20 years have gone by chasing the wrong target. Cleaning up amyloid is like cleaning up the ashes after the house is burned down. Amyloid is not the root pathology. We know that now, but it took 20 years to get to that realization. Also in clinical trials, we have better inclusion criteria. It turns out that some of the trials before didn't enroll Alzheimer's patients. They were suspected Alzheimer's patients. What could go wrong? So there's been a lot of failures. We've learned a lot. We have better endpoints. We have better inclusion criteria. We have the ability to monitor endpoints that are more tied to dementia, surprisingly. We used to measure cognition. In fact, that was my primary endpoint in my Baxter trial was ADAS-Cog. That is a 40-year-old endpoint. We have better endpoints now. And we have better understanding of disease pathology. It's not perfect, but the way we're attacking Alzheimer's is completely different. We're inducing neuroplasticity, which strengthens the brain against some of the pathology, that it's the root of the pathology. So we've seen 2 successes now that are marginal successes of drugs getting over the line in Alzheimer's. So I think it's starting to change. We're starting to see that it is possible to have approvals in this space. The biomarkers are a lot more helpful now too. There didn't used to be any biomarkers. Now I have too few fingers to count the number of biomarkers that we can track, as well as imaging and electrophysiology. So I think the tide is changing, Diana. We just have to see a few more successes.
I hear it. And yes, I mean, sometimes investors are, as myself, are not, they are not so much risk takers. I tend to agree with that. And there's certainly the approval on the drug side is a good encouragement for the industry. Okay, but now let's move on into a different question. Neurotech, invasive versus non-invasive, right? Non-invasive, sometimes compliance issues, sometimes it's more visible to handle. Invasive by itself is more invasive, implantable solutions are. So clinical viability, scalability, and most importantly, reimbursement. Guys, how is that different in the 2 approaches? Gil, you want to start with that?
Sure. So viability, scalability, and reimbursement. Oh, that's a tough one. Okay, so viability. I think invasive BCIs win there. I think the ability to restore functions and the promise of restoring functions is outweighs the risk associated with the invasiveness. And I think as we gain more understanding of how to do that right, I think that viability will only grow. I think in scalability, it's quite the opposite. I think, as it goes without saying, non-invasive neurotech is by definition more safe. I think there's more pathways to get that to patients and survivors at need, and ultimately the cost associated with those type of technologies are lower. So I would say in the context of scalability, non-invasive wins. I think that the hard one really is reimbursement, and there I think the jury's still out. I think when you think about invasive technologies, which is something I focus on more, I think we're kind of starting to see the third wave of what that is. So the first one was very academic heavy, understanding of decoding principles of the brain, mainly in universities across the globe. And then the second one, and Matt, you've been part of that kind of a decade-ish, a little more. How do we try to translate that knowledge into what will be one day commercial technologies? And I think now we're starting to see the third, which is how do we take that knowledge and how do we take those technologies and really translate them into viable businesses that are long-term. And to the non-invasive, I won't speak to that path as I'm less familiar, but I think we're at a point where both of those are kind of, the technology is ripe to go into that third phase. So there's technologies, but as we all know, speaking about the U.S. Healthcare system, the U.S. healthcare system does not buy technologies, right? The U.S. healthcare system buys solutions to unmet clinical needs that are better than the current standard of care, and that have the potential for long-term to be viable economically. And I think that's where both technologies, invasive and non-invasive, are going to be put to the test in the next few years of how to be able to get there.
Yeah. Heike, you want to
Sure.
advocate for the non-invasive wearable approach,
Sure.
maybe?
So from how I really see this is for both approaches, they have to be safe and effective, right? So for the patient, for the reimbursement, and they have to they must deliver measurable, successful clinical outcome to be clinical viable. And then in terms of scalability, I think actually that depends on ease of use, cost, reliability, and whether the technology can be integrated seamlessly into the care pathway. And I do see that for the invasive approach, probably the hurdle or the barrier is higher because that is higher, is riskier, it requires surgery and probably more expensive. But in terms of non-invasive approach, the barrier for scalability will probably lower because it's it's easy to deploy and should be less expensive compared to implantable technologies.
Yeah.
But I think similar to what Gil said, right? The biggest hurdle is still reimbursement. I'm not sure you guys are aware of this or not, but there's only one non-invasive BCI technology from Neuroscience. The product is called IPSI Hand. They got the CMS reimbursement coverage. So I think this kind of deliver a message that as long as a product or BCI technology can provide solid evidence to show clinical benefit to the patients, there's a likelihood that CMS will cover the cost. Yeah, bring the product into the coverage.
Okay.
I think we need to reframe the concept of invasiveness and what is, in my opinion, a little bit more mature, like risk and harm-based way. So are opioids invasive? I mean, they're really scalable. They're doing really well commercially, but I would argue that opioids are actually quite invasive. Recently, there was a published paper coming out of UCSF where someone received a DBS-based approach for pain management that significantly reduces their pain levels. It's a surgery, but I don't know. If I were suffering from chronic pain, I would sooner get the surgery than start taking opiates. Electroconvulsive therapy. That was a really good non-invasive approach. But I think obviously you need to think about what are you getting and what risks are you exposing yourself to. And surgical risk is just one of the possible types of risk. I mean, you can go on Amazon and buy TMS units that can stimulate your brain that aren't regulated by the FDA and can make profound changes inside of your brain. I would say that possibility is more dangerous than enrolling yourself in a clinical trial and being implanted by a neurosurgeon.
I totally agree, by the way, and I'm looking forward some regulatory changes in that as a matter, as a parent, above all, because I mean, any kids can buy one online and stimulate, and there's a whole trend of, yes, let's make us more efficient, more memory, more proficient. Oh my God, no, that's without any prescriber being around, any doctor. That's.
I may add a small note. So what I mean, invasive is the risk compared between invasive and non-invasive. I think there's a huge difference, right? One requires surgery, one doesn't require surgery. And in terms of DBS you mentioned, most of the DBS they do not, they implant the device in the chest. They open the pocket here instead of open your skull to put the device. I think there's different surgical procedure, different technique for the implantable devices.
Yeah.
Just want to add a note.
Yeah. Now, but the question is, obviously, the drugs can be much more invasive than what we think of. But on the device side, I mean, stimulating nerves sometimes or getting to brain through magnetic approach, you somehow can do that with implantable and non-implantable. That was more the question. Drugs, yes, drugs. I definitely think.
Yeah, LSD is really easy to deliver.
Right. Yeah.
Not surgical at all.
Okay. So one question to you all, given that we kind of touched on drugs, and how do we position device towards drug? Are we becoming more are we going to compete? Are we becoming more an add-on? Are we on? Is it different indication by the indication? We've seen recently approval for neurosim devices on to treat autoimmune diseases like arthritis, and that to me is very much of a competing approach to very systemic drugs. And so you are addressing a market that is today is only addressable. Alzheimer's is only addressable with drugs. So that's competing or?
Simple answer. It's not competing with drugs. Now, non-invasive brain stimulation of the default mode network, what we're doing is we're inducing neuroplasticity network-wide. Again, when you stimulate networks, they strengthen. That's the simple answer. If you want the detailed answer, we just published an MOA paper in a top journal on how this stimulation actually works, and it's totally complementary to the drugs. Alzheimer's is a freight train. We're not going to do much more than slow it down, but the hope is through synergistic combinations of stimulation and drugs, maybe 1 + 1 = 3 or 4. So we'll see what the combinations bring. But just like HIV or some forms of cancer, most experts, in fact, almost all experts in the Alzheimer's space agree it's a combinatorial approach that will finally win the day and slow the disease to a halt. So we are the perfect substrate upon which to add a drug. Given we're non-invasive, almost no side effects, we can add any drug on top of our stimulation.
Thanks, Gil.
Yeah, I think in the context of BCI, specifically invasive BCIs, I don't think there's a drug alternative. I think we're going towards a new market that invasive BCIs ultimately will dominate since no type of pharmacology, or at least not the way we deliver pharmacology today or planning to deliver pharmacology in the next decade, will be able to compete. With that said, I think generally speaking about neurotech, I think you can actually compare it quite well specific to deep brain stimulation. In deep brain stimulation, patients that receive subthalamic nucleus stimulation, their medication can be reduced between 30 to 60%. Global spalatus stimulation, medication is usually reduced by less than that. And then overall, there's a back and forth between the treatment team, the neurologist, and the patient to really tune both the technology and the drugs that are given. So I think that's going to be the prevailing notion when thinking about neurotech at large. But I do think in the context specifically of invasive BCIs that are listening to the brain, that are listening to information and utilizing that information to do things that have not been possible. I do not see how that electrical activity, how that translation into connecting with the world is a competition.
Sorry, Gil. Matt, you mentioned ALS and mental health, dear markets. ALS, I don't think there's any drug approved, or maybe there's just one reason.
I think there's a lot of work going on in that space right now, but there hasn't been a slam.
Right. So
I see. Okay, on one hand, there's an obvious place like neuroprosthetics where there's not a drug alternative just on its face. I think what's more interesting is that there's a synergy between devices and drugs. You can see like pairing neuromodulation with plastinogens. So this is a way of enhancing the effect of neuromodulation by priming the body with small molecules. But you can also think of BCI as closing the loop on whether or not your small molecule is working in the brain. Right now, we don't have very good feedback on like how these molecules are modulating neural states. We kind of estimate pharmacokinetics based in a clinical trial, and then we just throw it out to a large population. And, a doctor gives people a standardized dose. But in a world of BCI, you could imagine closing the loop on these medications and people knowing what medicine to take when. You could do things that you would never do in a current neuropharmacology paradigm, like mix drugs. There's a woman whose work I really respect, Mariam Shaneki, and she is a control theorist. And she came into neuroscience and originally designed a closed-loop anesthesia controller. And now she's working in how to understand mood disorders and how to think about applying control theory to mood and other mental states. And I think that's the direction that this combination of BCI and pharmacology could be going.
Can I just jump on that?
Sure.
This is so important too. I love the idea that now we can measure brain states. Whether we can do it passively with EEG, or in our case, we're perturbing the system with pulses and seeing where the pulses travel in the brain, thus revealing the excitability of all parts of the brain. This is a great tool for the drug industry now to see the effects. Usually it's an indirect biomarker or some imprecise measure of mood, especially in depression, right, which is very subjective by definition. But now we can actually see the excitability of the brain in spatial temporal domains with exquisite precision. TMS evoked potentials are part of what we do, and they reveal reveal the brain in a way nothing else does. But tools like that, I think, are going to speed the runway for a lot of these drugs.
Okay, I'm just going to rephrase the question for you because, we know that drugs, when they're prescribed by technicians are used like to prescribe and take a pill, and then somehow it's already hard and difficult to switch their mindset and say, go to surgery, right? Instead of taking the pill, go to surgery, have the device implanted. But the one thing that's really not visible on the market, that doesn't happen very much in other indication, is prescribing a wearable. That is an association that, for example, in migraine, there are a number of devices. It has taken a lot of time for the physician, even with very good data, to associate a wearable specifically to something that is treating a disease.
Right.
How is that? And what can you do to accelerate? The wearable thing.
Sure. So I think the most important part will be to have the clinician to see the solid evidence, right? The benefit, the clinical benefit that can be, I would say, produced by the hardware intervention. So just a quick example, I think this kind of echoes the previous question. So in our patients who in our pivotal trial, so we got a few patients who received the treatment with our device for 2 months, and then after the 2 months, her pain level got reduced, and then which allow the patients, probably more than one, that they can decrease the use of the pain medication for a couple months. And another example is that in June, I believe it's on June 20th, we have a patient from Ukraine who got spinal cord injury, and I think Asia C or Asia D, and he is only 18 years old. And he got enrolled, in one of our European sites that on August 25th. And then simply after 5 sessions of treatment, he was able to move his left leg. And then just a few days ago, I was told that he got even better improvement on his forefingers, thumb and forefingers. And then he was first time able to use a fork to eat a cake by himself. So I would say by showing this evidence to the clinician, to the hospital, that's a key driver for them, to adopt the new technology and be willing to prescribe that to the patients.
Thank you. Very interesting. We are left with 5 minutes to the end of the panel, so I'm going to jump on the the closing futuristic question for you all. We're seeing BCI, we are imagining futuristic indications, even in not necessarily only on patients, but eventually on healthy individuals like the bionic man, but human enhancement in general. But it's really difficult to see how this is possible and what is the time frame, and also figuring out what FDA has, where do they stand and what do they have to say about it. I'd be really interesting to hear your thought on that, and maybe we start with the closer BCI people. Matt, you want to start it?
So I think in some ways, from a technology standpoint, it isn't hard to see how it would happen. We're going to start developing systems. We're already building a speech prosthesis system that'll also allows for direct computer control. So the same system that we provide to someone with ALS or spinal cord injury to interact with their computer is the kind of device that you might use to interact with the computer if you were healthy and you didn't want to touch the computer. There will be a few generations from now, better visual implants, better than second sight implants, the ones that are a minimal viable product. Those will continue to get better. And when you start approaching the acuity of 20/20 vision, then you've just built the best AR/VR system in the world. People are working on memory right now, like the same kind of interventions that are helping people who are losing their memory enhance their memory might end up being interventions that help people with normal levels of memory have super memory. And so I actually think these things will come about naturally, and it'll be a societal and a regulatory question how we handle it.
And Gil, or can,
Well, we're boosting memory today, right? You don't have to imagine a future. We published it just a few months ago. Our second generation brain stimulation of the default mode network boosts human memory by pretty astonishing amounts, 40, 50% more recall. Would you like to remember 40 to 50% more? We did the face name association test. I call it the cocktail party test. Can you remember someone's name? Most of us are pretty bad at that. Can you remember their face? Most of us are pretty good at that. Can you remember something about them? Like, oh, that's Ken. He's the CEO of Synaptica. Like, can you do that? That is what we're able to boost by something like 40 to 50%, and it's durable to a week. So the questions that raises, Diana, though, what disease are we treating? How is it regulated? You know,
is that a disease to
it's
start
not a
with?
disease. What's the indication for use? It's definitely not reimbursed, so it's cash pay. You know, it's human enhancement. It raises ethical questions on a societal level. Only those who could pay for it could boost their kids' SATs by, I don't know, 30, 40%. What is that worth? Well, now you have, you know, ethical dilemmas too at a societal level. So this is where the world is going now, and we have to face it head on because, you know, the idea that we're able to combine these different therapies to enhance human cognition, it's right here happening now.
But how is FDA approved the magnetic device to be on the market and delivered at home, both online by kids, just to boost the memory eventually? Without, how is that even possible? Tell me about FDA holds, because that must have been. I can't see anything else.
I talked to the former head of Neurostim for CDRH, who happens to be our consultant, and even he's perplexed. It's a gray area. He still doesn't even know how FDA is going to view this. If you want claims, sure, you have to go through an FDA submission. But if you want to, you know, allude to brain health, you know, maybe there's ways to circumvent. I'm a fan of doing things the right way, the scientific way. Do a rigorous study, get your claims, back your claims with real data. But there will be those who don't.
Yeah. Okay.
You'll see a lot of wellness devices marketed online.
Yeah.
I'm not in
That's in Europe, by the way.
I'm
in Europe, and the same MO.
under the skin wellness device.
An identical thing in Europe, by the way. You can buy it online here too. I mean, that's okay. Gil, sorry, your take on the bionic man of the future.
I think as Matt said, I think that the boundaries are already blurred, and you said this as well, and I think they're continued to be blurred. I think in the context of invasive systems, the FDA is still, of course, focused on therapeutic value, and correctly so. And I think there will need to be a more societal discussion of what is defined as healthy, what is defined as boosting. Of course, when we think about Alzheimer's, changing memory in Alzheimer's is a therapeutic need. Doing that for a high school student that is defined as healthy, of course, is not. That will continue to be blurred. And ultimately, what I think will win is data in clinical trials. Data that shows clear efficacy, data that shows right health economic outcomes. And I hope we can use that data to really build a robust view of how to utilize these technologies.
Okay.
Sure. So, you know, in terms of human enhancement for the healthy individuals, I think there's still probably a few more years for this to come. So if I'm now thinking about this human enhancement in a broader sense, I'll point out to the elderly population. So how can we use the neurotechnology to help the elderly people to walk faster, walk better, right? Regain their mobility longer. I think that is the problem that will be all faced in the future. I think it's, from my perspective, probably more interesting to work on this area.
Very good. I think we're just perfectly on time. So I'm going to thank you all for your very interesting points in the panel, and thank you all in the audience for listening to us, and looking forward next opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.